what happened essentially was that I feared that the Rajneesh might buy it or somebody else, because 5,000 acres and 12 miles of river, almost 24 miles of river bank, was kind of unbelievable, especially for the river that I think is the best one in the United States. So I immediately called up the Northwest Steelheaders, a guy named Chuck Voss, who's executive director. And I said, Chuck, can you get a meeting with Governor Atiyeh?
That was Frank Amato describing how he played a key role in protecting the lower Deschutes River back in the 1970s and 80s. This is the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, episode 113.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. Are you interested in heading out on an amazing Alaska trip? Go to wetflyswing.com/AK to get more details on the upcoming fly fishing trip this summer. In today's episode, I talk with Frank Amato, the man behind Salmon Trout Steelheader magazine and the Fly Fishing and Tying Journal, and who has published over 300 books through Amato Publishing. Frank talks about the beginning of STS back in 1967, the blue jet sled he has had for just about as long, and how he saved my butt on the Deschutes River when I was a young lad. Don't miss this one as Frank tells us where he got his name, the Clackamas River Cuckoo, and the best-selling book to date. Since 1977, the Fly Fishing and Tying Journal has long been considered the angler's magazine, with original how-tos and technical articles written by the best trout and steelhead anglers in the West. FTJ is committed to sharing exceptionally written essays, fiction, poetry, and in-depth guides to fly fishing destinations. FTJ is one of my go-to magazines, and if you haven't checked it out recently, you can get started by calling 1-800-541-9498 or heading over to the web at ftjangler.com. So, without further ado, here's Frank Amato. How's it going, Frank?
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I could be going a little bit better when it comes to fish numbers, but particularly steelhead and salmon. But otherwise, it's okay.
Yeah, no, I hear you. We're kind of going through a little bit of well, I guess the runs go up and down, and I think we're on a little bit of a downslide for sure, but hopefully that changes. I wanted to get into everything you have going, Amato books and the long list. I've known you, it seems like my whole life I've read and had a connection with what you have going. I'd love to hear, get into that, but first, can you tell us how you first got into fly fishing?
Well, I started fly fishing when my parents moved to Milwaukee. There was a little stream close to our home called Kellogg Creek. And at first, in the sixth grade, I think I started using manure worms, stuff that the local farmers would use in their truck farms or would be in their manure piles. And at a good day, we could maybe get some night crawlers, but when it got dry and in the summer and the night crawlers were down, we had to take manure worms, and they stunk. And when you put them on a bait hook, they would break. They were horrible little worms. So our goal in the summer would be to take a manure worm, catch a bullhead or sculpin, as we call them now, but we used to call them mud daubers. Catch one, strip the skin, and then use the white meat, and then bait fish for trout. Huh. And that worked real well because white meat on a bullhead is really tough, and you could fish for a long time and forget about the manure worm.
Nice. I said that was so that's at Kellogg Creek. Do you ever remember seeing any steelhead or salmon in there back in the day?
Yeah, Kellogg Creek in the 50s, it had steelhead in the wintertime. It had cutthroat from about sea run cutthroat they would come in as adults from about November until February. And it also had coho salmon. And it had a few other fish species as well, including even warm water species that eventually got up into it. But what killed it was essentially all of the suburban homes that were built. And every time a home would be built, there'd be more silt coming down. And I hated to particularly see that silt in the spring when the steelhead and salmon were spawning So now it has remnant fish in it, and that's about it.
Right, right. How did you go from, that period of time fishing with the mud doggers and all that stuff to, where you eventually got into thinking about opening up a publishing, operation?
Well, it was a big jump. And at first, the bait fishing ended up becoming fly fishing. Within a year or so, probably by the 7th grade, some of us kids would buy a few flies from a little sporting goods store in Milwaukee called Dick's Sporting Goods, and we would tie the fly onto our little rods, and so all we were using were like bait casting rods or steel fly rods, whatever we could get our hands on. And more than anything, we were dapping, just dropping the worm on the water. Well, we started reading as kids in the 6th, 7th, 8th grade about people using flies to catch trout. So we bought a couple flies, we tie them onto the monofilament leader, and then we would dap the flies in the riffles, and we were catching these essentially resident or steelhead smolts, and also some resident cutthroat. And that was all of a sudden a huge revelation that a fly could trick a trout into taking it, as opposed to night crawlers, crawfish tails, and algramites and all that kind of stuff. So once I got into high school, I went to Central Catholic, and they had a nice library there. And I remember getting hold of a book called The Old Man and the Sea, and it was written by Ernest Hemingway. And that was such a kind of interesting book about fishing for sharks and all of that off of Cuba that I started looking for more books on fishing, and in the school library. And they had a few books written by Roderick Haig Brown, the British Columbia fishing writer, and kind of one of the considered really to be almost the father of fly fishing in the Western world, or at least in North America. And so I started reading those books, and all of a sudden I realized that, books, especially ones on fly fishing for steelhead, I had to go to the Portland Public Library. So I'd take the bus, go down to Portland Public Library. And all this time I was in high school, I was working in a grocery store in my junior and senior years called Keno's. They had a chain of about 20 grocery stores at that time in the early 60s, late 50s. I got a job as a box boy, and on my breaks, which were normally for half an hour or an hour, I was allowed, as other employees were, to take a magazine off the magazine rack in the store, as long as we replaced it, so we could read it during our lunch hour. And so the only magazines at that time were Field and Stream, Sports Field, and Outdoor Life, what we used to call the Big Three. Mm-hmm. Plus, there was another magazine called Western Outdoors that came out of California. Very rarely they would have an article about the Northwest, and that's where I got the idea to start a magazine about the Northwest. The only fishing publication at that time coming from the Northwest was something called Fishing and Hunting News, kind of a weekly newspaper that was interesting, but it didn't really have factual articles of any length, and it was essentially just a black and white newsprint. Yeah. So I thought, when I was by the time I was a senior in high school, I thought, well, if I ever get a chance to start a magazine, I kind of like to do that. I like to read. I liked printing. I was familiar with printing presses somewhat. And so I thought, that would, I'd like to publish a magazine, Northwest Fishing. So I went on to University of Portland, and I think that's where your father went too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right.
So I went to University of Portland, and I continued working at Keno's. And I worked towards a teaching degree. When I got out of college, then I taught a couple years at Central Catholic. By that time, I had well formulated what kind of a magazine I wanted to start, and I was able to raise a few $1,000s, my wife Gail and I, and a business partner and also fishing partner named Joseph Torres. And so we scraped together about $5,000, enough to print about one issue of the first issue of the magazine, plus pay for the subsidiary thing. First issue of Salmon Trout Steelhead came out in the summer of 1967.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it started kind of with a bang, and the summer of 67 was a great summer for my wife and I because we had our first baby. That would be Nick. He was born in June. The magazine came out in August, the first issue of Salmon Trout Steelheader. And we've also bought our first new car, a 67 Volkswagen, which I had for about 13 years.
Oh, wow.
And so it was the summer of 67 was a great summer. And from there, the magazine then continued to kind of slowly grow along.
Wow. That's awesome to hear that story. This is exactly what I was hoping to hear from you. You know, when I was talking to Craig in the past episode, we were talking about the fly fishing and tying journal and everything. And it's cool. You said 1967. It's interesting. You mentioned my dad. Well, my older brother, Chris, was born in 1967 of October, and that was also their first kid. So it's funny the similarities they had. You guys both had your first kid in the same year.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it?
That is cool.
Well, another thing that happened actually in 1966 in my second year teaching at Central. My wife and I were able to move close to Kellogg Creek to find a little house that was a tiny little 1-bedroom house. And by the time we left it after 6 years, by 72, we had, I think we had the two of our kids were living in the same bedroom, plus our cat, and plus Gail and I. So, fortunately, we were able to move out and get a bigger house. But so I was still actually able to kind of follow along with Kellogg Creek and see how it was doing. And then over the years, I saw things kind of get sad on it as far as fish were concerned. But the magazine was wonderful because it gave me the opportunity to travel and to fish from Alaska from Alaska to Chile, and essentially from Oregon to over into Italy and other places.
Yeah. What was so Salmon Trout Steelheader was in 1967. That was the first magazine. And then when did the Fly Fishing and Tying Journal, when did that start up?
Well, in 1967, of course, I started Salmon Trout Steelheader, and by about 1970 or 1971, the Federation of Fly Fishermen, which was a national conservation organization, still exists under a different name. But the Federation of Fly Fishermen their quarterly magazine was being published out of New York, and the national president was a guy named Lou Bell, an attorney up in Everett. And Lou was a subscriber to Salmon Trout Steelheader and liked the work I had been doing on it. So Lou asked to have a meeting with me to see if I would consider giving the Federation of Fly Fishermen proposing a contract to them whereby I would produce the Fly Fisher Quarterly magazine for the organization. So that was, like I say, about 1970. So from 1970 to 1976, published quarterly issues of the Federation for their maybe 5,000 or 10,000 members. And the magazine was edited by a fellow named Steve Raymond, who worked for the Seattle Times in Seattle and was an excellent writer and also excellent fly fisherman. And so Steve and I worked together for about 5 or 6 years. And one day, Steve said, gee, Frank, I think I want to write books. And instead of editing the Quarterly Fly Fisher, so, I'll be leaving. And so I thought, well, Salmon Trout Steelheader was doing well. And I thought, well, Steve, I think I'll leave too. And so for a year, I forgot about the Fly Fisher magazine for the Federation, and they selected a new publisher and a new editor, and they still publish their magazine quarterly to this day. Mm-hmm. And the organization, as conservation organization is concerned, has done extremely good work all across the United States and even in other parts of the world. So I decided then that with Salmon Trout Steelheader coming along so well, it was 6 issues a year in '77, that era. I actually bought a book. It was called Magazine Circulation and Magazine Publication. And I bought this book for like $40, thinking that, well, I'll kind of bone up on it to make Salmon Trout Steelheader better. Well, it turned out to be a book that told you how to start a magazine, the right way to start it. I had started the magazine without any advice other than from the staff of the Ramparts at Central Catholic, the high school newspaper. So I bought the book, spent some time reading it, and all of a sudden I thought, well, shoot, I think I'll start a fly fishing magazine for the Western United States, a commercial magazine, not to compete with the Fly Fisher, because that was a quarterly organizational magazine. And there was only one other magazine at that time on the fly fishing, and it was called Fly Fisherman, which had been started about a year after. It started in the East about a year after I started Salmon Trout Steelheader. Yeah, I think it started like 1968, and I started STS in '67. So I started Fly Fishing and Tying Journal, and the first editor was a fellow named Don Roberts, who was an excellent writer, and at the time he was also teaching in Eastern Oregon in John Day, and also in Grand Ronde. And so I started the Fly Fishing magazine, and so it's, I don't know, like 40 or 50 years down the line, and Salmon Trout Steelheader I think we just celebrated his 60th birthday.
Wow. That's amazing. That's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time. And actually during that period of time, well, it wasn't much after I started Salmon Trout Steelheader that I attended a Northwest Steelheaders steelhead fishing clinic. They would hold an annual clinic every year in December when the winter steelhead would start coming back. And they held one in the Mayflower Milk Auditorium down by the Ross Island Bridge, and they invited me to have a table and to display Salmon Trout Steelheader. So I was sitting at the table and watching the president of the organization, a fellow named Bill Lush, give a talk, standing up on the stage, and maybe 100, 150 people listening to him avidly as he talked about the different techniques for catching steelhead. Different gear fishing techniques with bait and spinner and like that. And the people were listening with such avid interest, as well as myself. And this was, again, 1970, 3 years after I'd started the fishing magazine. I knew people were interested in reading about steelhead. So I asked Bill at the end of his talk if he could write a manuscript exactly the way he had delivered it on the stage. And he said, Frank, he was a longshoreman in North Portland. He said, sure, I can do that. And he said, I'll give you a call when it's finished. So a couple months went by. I got in my Volkswagen, drove out to North Portland. And here Bill was at his home and invited me in for lunch. And he had this handwritten, about maybe 70, 80-page manuscript, single-spaced. And they said, here, Frank, here's a manuscript on steelhead drift fishing. So I hadn't, told him that it should be typed or double-spaced or anything like that. So I had, the handwritten copy, and I had someone else transcribe it. And in the meantime, I wrote a little section on how to fly fish for steelhead, because by that time I'd been doing that for quite a while. But I was not an expert in any means, but I could catch steelhead with a fly at least. But I wrote a little section of the book, maybe 20 pages on fly fishing for steelhead, and Bill maybe 80 pages on gear fishing. And that book just took off like a rocket because nothing like it existed on the Pacific Coast. There was only one book that I had really seen that was written previous, and that was by a guy named Enos Bradner.
Oh, yeah.
Who was the outdoor writer of the Seattle Times and well known in the Seattle area.
What was the name of the book? What was the name of the book?
Mm-hmm. You mean the book we published?
Yeah.
Yeah, the one we published was called Steelhead Drift Fishing and Fly Fishing.
Okay, and was that the first book you published?
Yeah, that was the first book we published, and I actually went down to the printer, and that's further along in the story. Yeah, and that was the first book that we published, and it was locally printed.
Okay, and so that's your first
all
book.
Black and white.
Okay, and it's all in black and white. And so that's your first book. And now, how many, when you look back now, do you know how many books total you've published that are out there?
It's close to 300.
300 books, and that covers all. Would you say an equal amount of fly fishing and gear fishing, or is it just a mix of things?
The majority of the books were fly fishing and fly tying. And then right after that would be gear fishing, like Northwest gear fishing for steelhead and salmon. And after that would be some guide type books.
Oh yeah, the guides.
Guide books.
The maps and the guides and stuff like
that.
And
and then there were probably 30 or 40 that were river running and, how to handle drift boats and kind of technique boats. Or books.
How did you go about, with all those 300 books? I mean, how do you decide what book to publish next? I mean, through that whole process, did you just, what was that process like?
It was just like opening up a box of candies, and somebody would offer me one.
There you go.
It would come in the mail. And there were a lot of school teachers that knew how to write and knew how to fish. A lot of professional people, doctors would write books, and lawyers would write books, and even had maybe a couple books written by women. But there were a lot of really educated people that liked to fish and had interests in certain specialties of either fly fishing or gear fishing, and got manuscripts from all over the United States, but mainly, of course, from the Pacific Coast.
Nice. I was just thinking, and this is as we, there's so much here where, Frank, we're not going to be able to cover everything, obviously all these books and everything, but I love hearing the story of the STS and FTJ. I did want to hit on one thing that's a little bit random, just to see if you remember this. We kind of have a connection with the Deschutes, and, I also wanted to get into a little bit of what you would consider your home water, if you wanted to, talk about that here in a bit. But do you remember a time maybe 20 years ago, you were up, and you have a sled, right? Don't you have a sled you take up the Deschutes? It's like a wooden sled?
Blue one. Yeah, I called it Old Blue. I bought it about 1980 when it was a salesman sample for Lumaweld. And I had been on the Deschutes River Advisory Committee appointed by Governor Tia, I believe it was.
Oh, yeah.
And there were about 15 of us on the board representing the local railroad and the counties and the politicians and the police and the Indians. And we were put together to suggest some legislative proposals to pass in the Oregon legislature to make, to protect the Deschutes in effect. So one of the things I wanted to do at that time was to take the jet boats off of the Deschutes because they were really noisy, and there weren't that many of them at that time in the late 70s, early 80s, but they were coming on faster and faster. And of course, they make a lot of noise. Well, I was just at that point, I was just a drift boat fisherman. And but then being on the committee, of course, there were people that had jet boats and spoke up for them, particularly guys on the lower river. And so we listened to them and decided that, well, maybe take the boats off of the upper river, the jet boats above Maupin, but from Shears Falls on downstream, have a jet boat season. So I decided when the vote went against me to take them off of the entire river, that I would buy a jet boat. So virtually the next day, I went out and bought Old Blue, and I've had that boat since 1980. And
that's awesome. That's awesome.
I would use it on the I used it on the lower Deschutes. Yeah, I didn't have anything against jet boats except the noise. But if they weren't going to take them off the river, then no reason not to get one.
That's
myself.
it. I was going to say the old if you can't beat them, join them, right?
Yeah, that was it. And it was an 80 horse outboard, and I had to get a new engine when that washout rapids was created by a big storm up around Lockett. And in fact, I was supposed to have been on the river the weekend that happened, just camped a little bit above it, but I missed it. But the next week when I went up to go back to my area I like to camp in, I came around the corner, and all of a sudden I saw this, it looked like a 10 or 12 foot wall of water coming. And I knew there was no way, I didn't think there was any way I could go up that. But the guy I was with said, yeah, Frank, we can do it. And there was a camera crew from one of the local stations. They were all eager to watch us attempt it. And I decided, no way.
Yeah.
So I went back to Portland and got a little more powerful motor. And the other motor was already about 10 or 15 years old. And, but I decided not to attempt it the next time. And then after about one winter, a pathway opened up. And since then, it's been easy.
Yeah, it's easy now. That's the thing. Well, do you remember in that boat back in, say, maybe 20 years ago, coming up through Gordon Ridge Rapids and coming up from the bottom and seeing an upside-down raft and two people picking up their gear?
Exactly. I did.
Remember that? And you helped?
The raft was anchored to the bottom, stuck. It was the one I'm thinking of, but there was one that was stuck in the rapids. But this one was before that.
Yeah. Well, this one, just to refresh your memory, I was down there with a friend of mine who, when we were going through Gordon Ridge, it was kind of windy that day, and we went through the top of Gordon Ridge in a raft, and the wind hit us broadside and basically flipped us. The first time I've ever flipped over, and we had like 5 days of all of our gear, a full trip. And
did we get your oar back?
Yeah, exactly. So I was swimming, and you came. You were pretty much the only person on the river that day, and you picked me and my buddy up, and you helped us get our oars and picked up some gear. And you gave us a ride at the end. By that time, we had walked a mile down below Gordon, but you gave us a ride, and we went through the lower rapid, and you hit that first wave in the lower rapid, and it felt like the entire river came over the boat, and we just were. I was like, wow, this is intense. That's
right.
I
do remember that.
That was us.
That's incredible.
I know.
Incredible, because that was even before a couple of other people I've helped up there. That is amazing. That's fantastic.
I know. It's pretty cool.
I can't wait to tell my wife and sons that one. That's great.
I've told that one for years, because to this day it's the only time I've ever dumped, on the Deschutes, and it was kind of, and then of course and you have the old. I mean, you have a run. The Amato run is named after you up there below at the tail out there. I think that's somewhere in that area.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
The
area from Lockett on up to about. Well, let's see. Where's the road that comes in? Just off the hill. Courts. Yeah, off the hill.
Yeah.
From there,
Cologne.
Up to about Max Canyon. All of that was really my favorite.
Oh, okay.
The water.
You fished it all.
That's what I consider, if anything, my home water. But yeah, what a wonderful river.
That is cool. Well, I wanted to touch base, I mentioned your home water, and do you consider the Deschutes, or do you have another river that you kind of consider you fish a lot nowadays?
Oh, there's little rivers that I fish, but the Deschutes has always been, in fact, I was supposed to fish it tomorrow, actually, with an Indian guide.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
I can't think of his name. Little Leaf.
Yep.
I think his name is.
That's right, Little Leaf.
I was going to fish it with friends who invited me, but I've had a health problem and I can't go tomorrow. Darn it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's too bad. Well, getting back to the book. So, do you know which book is kind of your best-selling book of kind of over the years?
Of all times, one of the best-selling books we ever had, and probably about the best-selling how to fly fish book ever, is one called Curtis Creek Manifesto.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, it was written a fellow from San Francisco, originally from Utah. And he was kind of a ringer for Long John Silver, about 6'2", probably 225 pounds. And he'd devour a bottle or two of scotch before having a baked pork meal. And he was an incredible guy. Yeah, he always wore black and had the black cowboy hat on, and really a gruff guy. And he wrote, I think, the masterpiece on how to fly fish called the Curtis Creek Manifesto. And it's probably sold a couple 100,000 copies, just at a guess, over the years.
Yeah.
And when it first came out, it was so popular that some people were buying like even 10 or 12 copies at a time to give to their friends they had been trying to teach how to fly fish. And it came out about 1977 when fly fishing was just starting to catch on in a big way. And but great book.
Yeah, that is
in
a good
fact, the author in there did a little hilarious cartoon of me, and because the book is actually done as a kind of looks like a black and white comic book.
Yep.
And he had a little funny looking creature in it that he called the Clackamas River Cuckoo. And I had a white patch of hair on my head, dark hair with a white patch. And so that's where he got the Clackamas River Cuckoo, and he kind of
that's awesome.
made it after me.
I didn't realize. I'll have to look at my copy and check that out. That's
the Clackamas Cuckoo. And he, of course, being from San Francisco and Utah, he really wasn't familiar with the Clackamas River. But then Clackamas River and came to be well known, and of course, Clackacraft boats had started up, and so that was another reason to know the Clackamas River. It didn't have terribly outstanding fishing, but it was a great river.
Yeah,
and so and a great name.
Right. Let's take a little break for a word from our sponsor.
Since 1977, the Fly Fishing and Tying Journal has long been considered the angler's magazine, with original how-tos and technical articles written by the best trout and steelhead anglers in the West. FTJ is committed to sharing exceptionally written essays, fiction, poetry, and in-depth guides to fly fishing destinations. FTJ is one of my go-to magazines, and if you haven't checked it out recently, you can get started by calling 1-800-541-9498 or heading over to the web at ftjangler.com.
Okay, back to the show. Do you guys publish books from all around? I mean, it's more of a West, but you cover books all around the country, topics and.
Yeah, we've actually even produced a couple of books that were written by people in England, outside the country, and they were mainly fly tying books, and at times it was probably for some of those writers in England easier almost to get their books published in the United States than in England, because the market was so much larger. And this was particularly true for people wanting to do dry fly books or nymph books or specialty fly fishing or fly tying books.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We even did a book for an actual lord.
Huh.
And he had a lord title from Scotland, and a fly tying book, but he told us, unfortunately, the castle and the property didn't go with the title anymore. but he was actually a lord, and he was a nice lord.
There you go. Well, so where do you think now with I mean, it sounds like your sons are kind of taking over the operation there. I mean, where do you see as you look at down in the future, where do you see kind of Salmon Trout, Steelhead, or Amato publications going? Do you see it sticking on the same path, or do we expect big changes?
Well, it's really hard to say, because communications have changed so much, and it's hard to say. I think the only thing that is dependable is change, and whether it's going to be tremendous change, a little change, it's hard to say. But newspapers have had a hard time. But generally, specialty magazines have been able to do okay because of their kind of specialized topics.
Yeah.
So the future is hard to say what's going to happen.
How have you kept up with the change over the years? I mean, have there ever been a time with STS or the other magazine? I guess you have a third one now too, but where you maybe thought, it wasn't going to make it? Have you ever had any times like that, rough times?
Oh, we've thought about possibly changing the publishing frequency and things of that nature, but as far as the publishing, no.
Yeah, it's all been going. And is STS cover a little bit fly fishing? I mean, it's mostly kind of gear related, right? Or does it cover a little bit?
It started out where it was probably 50% fly and 50% gear fishing. And then when we started the fly fishing magazine 10 years after STS, then we kind of separated.
Yep.
Then it had less fly fishing in it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so, now it's percent fly fishing, 80% gear fishing.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have a favorite other than your own stuff? Any other favorite books or resources? I guess we could think steelhead. It sounds like is kind of a species you've spent a lot of time on.
Well, I've always been a reader, and so there are some specialty magazines on steelhead. I can't think of any of their names offhand, but they're published like maybe a couple times a year.
Yep.
And those are kind of fun to read. They don't really teach you much about how to fish for them, but they have the philosophy and they have incredible photography and artwork. And
that's right.
So I enjoy looking at those books occasionally, but otherwise, what I really like to do is to personally fish as much as I can.
That's right. That's what it sounds like. Yeah, you like to go off and fish a lot just on your own, right? You head out to your special place and just do it.
I do it, and I like to use these little one-man rubber boats because even on a crowded weekend, you can find a river or a stream like the Malala or the parts of the Clackamas or East Louis or Washougal, and you can put that little boat in, drift 3-4 miles, and walk back up to your car and maybe see hardly anybody and get some good fishing in. And it's just, they're wonderful. And for a guy like me, who's now 77, I can still wade and be inside the little boat and swing a fly, or if the water's a little too high, swing a wobbler or a spinner or drift a float in a jig.
Yeah.
And so the fishing now, I probably do a little less of it, but I'm more efficient and I enjoy it as much as ever. Plus, there's nothing like sitting in one of these one-man boats. It's like fishing in a sofa. And it's just fantastic as long as you dress warm.
Yeah. Is the boat do you know a name of the boat? Is this like one of the Watermasters or one of those small boats?
Yeah, like a Watermaster. I think there's maybe only a couple things out there, little inflatable boats that are that small that are good. But they make one, and I think there's an outfit in Utah. I can't think of their name, but they make one too.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah. Oh, cool. I'll put a link to some in the show notes to some of the stuff we're talking about here to make sure so people can connect with the resources.
Sure.
What do you have a project? Of all the years here now, you're talking about 60 years. Anything you're most proud of about Amato Publications, stuff you've done over the years?
Well, what I'm most proud about is probably helping to kind of save the Deschutes, to preserving it. And back in, I guess it was like the late 70s, early 80s, when the Rajneesh and his followers were very popular and had a lot of money in the John Day River, just one river system away from the Deschutes, like maybe 40 air miles. The lower 12 miles of the Deschutes came up for sale by the people that lived in California that had bought the property, thinking that dams would be built there and that they would have a financial bonanza. But the dams were never built in that lower 12 miles. And so they put the property up for sale for, I think, 5,000 acres for a couple $1 million. And had I had a couple $1 million, I probably would have bought it myself. But what happened essentially was that I feared that the Rajneesh might buy it or somebody else, because 5,000 acres and 12 miles of river, almost 24 miles of riverbank, was kind of unbelievable, especially for the river that I think is the best one in the United States.
Yeah.
So I immediately called up the Northwest Steelheaders, a guy named Chuck Voss, who's executive director. And I said, Chuck, can you get a meeting with Governor Atiyeh? Because something's come up and someone has proposed to make a private fishing club on the lower 12 miles of the river, and for $2,000 a share or something like that, or maybe $10,000 a share, you could buy in on it. Because the guy was going to try and sell 200 shares for his first 200 people at, I think, $10,000 a share or something like that. And so I thought, the state's got to buy this. And I can't, as an individual, I can't put together an organization to try to buy it. So I thought, well, if the steelheaders say it's a good idea or they want to have a meeting, maybe we can get it. So, in no time, I was sitting at the Capitol in Vic Atiyeh's office telling them what we've just discussed, the fact that the state's got to buy this property. Otherwise, it's going to fall into private hands. And the person named Doug Robertson, who had come to me with kind of a red herring to get this all started, he asked me if I would put a free 1/3 page ad in Salmon Trout Steelheader and also our fly fishing magazine advertising these $10,000 lots, you might say, or $10,000 shares in the Deschutes. I looked at Doug and I said, is this for real? And he kind of was a poker player almost. And he said, well, Frank, that's kind of what I want to do. And he wanted me to run the ads for free, knowing, I think, that I would immediately, run out looking for help, which I did. And so I explained this to the governor with Doug Robertson sitting at my side as a potential purchaser for the private club, and also with Chuck Voss, executive director of the Northwest Steelheaders, and then, of course, Vic Atiyeh. Well, the Atiyeh had a rosy look in his eyes, or kind of a watery look in his eyes. He got up out of his chair, big chair, lit a cigarette, started walking around the room saying how much he loved the Deschutes and how he'd been there as a kid too. And then he said, well, I'll look into see what maybe we can do through the state parks. So then as we were walking out the door, he said, and in the meantime, Doug, don't sell that last share because I might want to buy it. So he was a clever guy, the governor. And so the governor talked to the fellow was the head of state parks. I can't think of his name now. And state parks thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to bring kind of a patrimony into the state for the fishermen and the people that love the Deschutes. So they got a guy named Alan Kelly, who had been on the Game Commission and was a good go-getter. They made him kind of the chairman of the Deschutes committee to raise the money, the $2 million to buy it. And so, I essentially initiated all that. I didn't do a lot of the work because it was like lighting a match to a haystack. It went up like crazy, and it just caught on fire, and everybody wanted to contribute and work towards it. And so that's my my proudest accomplishment. Cool. I just happened to have the magazine that made it all possible to get the word out.
And what year was that when it started, when it went through, or when it started there?
It's probably like around 82, something like that. Yeah,
I think I remember that. Weren't there? I think people even made some. There were stickers and little emblems. It was like love the Deschutes or something like that, right? I love the Deschutes and all sorts of.
And a couple of years Yeah, and a couple of years before that, when I was on the Deschutes River Advisory Committee, I was responsible for getting the boaters pass. The boaters fee that we pay now, that everybody pays. I was responsible for seeing that got passed as well.
Yeah,
that was one of the advisory things that came out of the Deschutes River Advisory Committee that ATIA put together, and so I got a call from the state parks fellow, and he said, Frank, a lot of this other legislation we've passed, but the canoers and the people that have soft boats, they don't want to pay a fee to use the river.
Right.
And the bill had passed, I think it had passed either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. It was held up by one committee and one member of that committee, who was the chairman of the committee, and the Senate, Oregon Senate. And so he called me up and said, Frank, is there any way that you could help us to change this individual's mind, to put some pressure on him? And I said, well, who is he? And so I got his name, and it was Senator so-and-so from down on Marshfield area. And so I called Chuck Voss, and I said, can the Steelheaders help out here? We've got one guy who's holding up this way of preserving the lower Deschutes by having some money to manage it for toilets and all that, or a river use fee. And so Chuck Voss said, well, there's a chapter of the Northwest Steelheaders in South or North Bend and Marshfield, that area, Northwest Steelheaders chapter, and every year they have the chairman of the committee, the person who was saying no to this increase, and I'll have them contact him. So they contacted him and changed his mind and changed the vote, and it went through.
Wow.
And since that time, that decision and that success in the legislature has raised, I would guess, anywhere from $5 to $10 million or more for purchase of more property along the Deschutes. And part of that money was also used to help initiate the fund to buy the 12 miles of the lower river as well.
There you go.
So those are the two things that I was fortunate to be involved in from their conception.
Yeah. Yeah, those are huge. Those are legacy things that people probably don't even think about now that are new to it. But yeah, you were part of. And
there was a third. There was a third thing that predated all of this concerning the Deschutes. The Army Corps of Engineers, or the Bureau of Land Management from Prineville, wanted to make a kind of a paved road, or at least an open road without any locked gates, from the Dalles all the way up to Warm Springs Bridge, 100 miles, open up that road to all forms of transportation. And so they published the 100-page study of it with photographs and river mile by river mile as to, whether the Indians owned that part or whether it was privately owned or whether it was owned by club. And I took that whole report and published almost all of the segments mile by mile in a copy of Salmon Trout Steelheader.
Oh, cool.
And I put a cover of the Deschutes. I made a cover of the Deschutes. I put a big cross through it and some kind of a headline saying, the Deschutes is going to be forever trade. It's going to be forever changed if this goes through. Well, all, maybe 20,000 readers of Salmon Trout Steelheader in Oregon got a chance to see it on the newsstands and wherever else. And finally the word got into the press, and then people talked to Governor McCall.
Uh-huh.
And Governor McCall, Tom McCall, decided that he would come to the public hearing at the Bonneville Power Administration in Portland. There must have been 500 people.
Wow.
That auditorium was absolutely jam-packed with people. This was probably in the late 70s.
Okay.
And it was just standing room only, and up on the deck or the stage with Tom McCall were the couple guys from the Bureau of Land Management office in Prineville who had prepared and spent years putting this study together. And they thought it was what everybody wanted because some of the people that wanted it were in the Dalles. The guys at the Dalles wanted to be able to get on the Deschutes and just drive up it on a road alongside it and open it up. And there were other people that wanted to drive along it too, but not many, because the overwhelming amount of people wanted to preserve the Deschutes in as wild a setting as possible, with as few roads and vehicles and campers along it. So Tom McCall gave a talk that was unbelievable, a speech, decrying how it would destroy the canyon of the Deschutes if this program went through. He got like a 5-minute standing ovation by everybody there, and it was the most dramatic single conservation event I've ever experienced.
Yes.
And it was killed, and no one has ever squeaked about it ever since.
No. And so basically they were proposing to build a road from essentially on the east side where the rail line used to be all the way up the Deschutes.
Exactly. The railroad grade would be the base, and they would take down the lock gates at the lower part of the river. They would also open up the lock gates at the Deschutes Club.
Yeah.
And I'm not crazy about lock gates, but on the other hand, you have to have, some gems that we've got to protect. And if a person can't ride a bicycle up there, can't ride a horse, or he breaks his leg and can't walk along it, I mean, you can't just open everything up.
No. And it's huge because, that river I floated or walked or I've been on every foot of that river. And, when you get down to Max Canyon, and again, I don't have a sled, so I still have a little bit. I'm like, I've got the drift boat, but when you put that drift boat in and you just realize, you got 25 miles and the only thing you're not going to see any cars. And it's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, it's just it's a world, because it would be totally different if you knew there would be cars and things. So that's pretty amazing, Frank. I didn't know that story.
I had an intimate relationship with the Deschutes, and I just I love it above all other rivers. There's so many times I found myself fishing in maybe Montana or Alaska or even South America, and thinking to myself, why in the hell am I not fishing in the Deschutes?
Yeah, that's right.
It's just a magic place.
It is. I was going to ask you that kind of, what on your list of places around the world do you have, that you'd still like to get to? Is it one of those things where you don't really even think about that too much anymore?
Well, one of the places I always wanted to get to was actually South America, to Chile, and just to see what fishing was like down there. And I got invited by Pan Am to go down there back in the mid-'50s when Pinochet was still the dictator of Chile. And we went down and we fished what's called the Lakes region down around Puerto Montt, maybe 500 miles south of Santiago. And then I got an opportunity to fish on Tierra del Fuego for the sea run brown trout that come up from Argentina.
Yep.
And that I just absolutely loved, because unlike Alaska, you didn't have to worry about bears or any animals. Right. and you could, and at that time, there weren't any people going down there hardly, other than the people that raised sheep, the Sonceros.
Yep.
And there was nothing worse than nothing that, snakes. There were some wild puma, and but nothing dangerous about it. The only thing was, a lot of wind, but that was fine, because anybody that could fish the Deschutes could fish pretty much any place.
Oh yeah.
When it comes to wind,
right.
And so I love that. That's a place that I returned to for many years, actually.
There you go. Yeah, that's a place definitely on my bucket list. I want to get down to, hopefully in the next couple of years. Well, Frank, we're getting ready to wrap this up. I just had a few more questions for you, if you have a little time.
Yeah.
So out of all this stuff, we talked about obviously all the books and, and the magazines and the conservation. I mean, to this day, is there anything about fly fishing and specifically that gets you excited, or, has anything changed over the years, just with fishing in general? What gets you fired up these days?
Well, the sad thing is, I think the global warming that is leading to a change in our anadromous fisheries. I think that the oceans seem to be losing their fertility, and there's not as many herring and just things for steelhead and salmon to eat in the ocean. And that scares the hell out of me. And I won't, I'm 77, I won't live long enough to see much of a turnaround if one occurs.
Right.
On the other hand, there are still wonderful, incredible fishing experiences, but people have to think in terms of how great it is to hook one fish or to see a fish.
Yep.
Or even not to hook a fish, but to maybe see an otter, or to just getting out on the stream and enjoying where you are with the hope of hooking one of those miracle fish. It's just, steelhead and salmon and trout, they're just miraculous and beautiful. They take us to the most beautiful parts of the world. And, just try to be as good as we can.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as you were talking there, I was kind of thinking about Haig Brown again. You mentioned him at the start of the show. I mean, when you think about his time that he was there, do you see, obviously he talked about some of the conservation issues back then as well. Do you remember, does anything stick out from what you read and learned from him over the years?
Well, I think that, he kind of maintained that fishing was an excuse to be either in a river or close by a river, and feeling the water curl around his leg and the push of the currents, against his waders, and, and the birds and everything. I give you a crazy example. I was fishing the Wainuchi River in Southwest Washington 2 weeks ago, and I was fly for chum salmon, and I hooked a chum, and I was swinging the fly, and off the chum goes, and they're powerful fish, and it was a bright fish. And my friend, he was down there getting ready to net it about maybe 100, 150 feet below me, because it was in a classic run, and the chum just kept going. And finally, I couldn't understand why I couldn't work him in. And my friend yells up to me, he says, Frank, there's an otter trying to steal your salmon. Yep. And so then I looked, and I could see the otter's back where the salmon was. And the friend went to net the fish, and I think he was trying to net the otter too, but the otter let go of the fish. So I played the fish over and, hurried up, got down there to watch the fish before it was released. And sure enough, you could see the puncture marks on the fish where the otter had grabbed onto it. But, those are the kind of things that's the first time in my life that I'd ever had that kind of experience. But anytime you're on the river, something new and memorable is bound to happen.
That's true. No, that's totally true. Well, I just, I had a couple of, I always ask a couple questions on kind of the top 2 flies, top 2 tips, top 2 resources.
Sure.
And I guess we're kind of thinking about steelhead here, talking about the Deschutes. Would you have a couple of flies, if you're out there swinging flies that you kind of always go to?
Well, to start, I even in any river that I'm fly fishing, if the water's too high, I happily switch over to using a wobbler, and I'll take the wobbler and use a pretty small hook on it, and use maybe any kind of a wobbler, anything from a steely to a pixie,
like a silver,
and I love
silver steely or something.
Exactly, and for either silvers or for or cohos, and for steelhead, I love to just cast it out and let it swing around, and then take a step and cast, step, cast, step, cast. Fish it exactly the way you would a wet fly.
Okay.
And I like to use a small barbless hook and a hook that's really got a weak wire. One that if you hook like a Chinook or you hook a big fish, if you just pull on the line, you can bend the wire.
Oh, wow.
So the barbless hook just comes out, and you don't have to, fight the fish and possibly hurt it. And it doesn't cost you anything for, it cuts your wobbler costs in half because it's a soft wire hook.
Yeah.
And so that's what I do. And a lot of times even if there are a lot of salmon around, I'll just use a soft wire hook and just cut off the hook and just to have the satisfaction of just knowing that I would have hooked that fish, but I felt the bump and I felt the grab, and maybe he swam 3 feet with it in his mouth, but he spit it out.
Yep.
So that works out too. Instead of catching fish after fish after fish, on those rare occasions when you come across a lot of fish.
Yeah. No.
So I like to give the fish every chance, that I can.
Yep. Yeah.
Now, as far as the technique, swinging the wobbler is great. On an eddy, I'll do the same thing, but I'll use a spinner oftentimes. And again, with a weak hook and a barbless hook, and maybe even a partially bent open hook, so that because coho have a tendency to want to take wobblers and spinners deep, and so I try to do as little damage as possible to them, because all the wild ones we release, and same way with the steelhead. So doing as little damage as possible to the fish. Mm-hmm. Fly fishing wise, for the fly that I've used on the Deschutes all this time, I call it the Night Dancer.
Yep.
And essentially it's a kind of a black body with a silver ribbing and a kind of a purple throat or purple blue. It varies, a little red tail, and that fly is
it's a great fly.
Hooked lots of fish for me in different sizes.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I got the idea for it. I was talking to that great guide on the Clackamas, Bob Tillman.
Oh, Tillman, yeah.
And I said, Bob, I said, I notice, a lot of times when I'm fishing the Deschutes, the fish seem to be away from the channel that the jet boats are using. They're off to the side. And Bob said, that's because they hate that sound of the jet boat, and it scares them over, which of course I knew anyway. And of course Bob always had a Mercury on his jet boat, and blue and black are the colors. And so Bob kind of theorized that if you did a fly that had some blue and black in it, the fish might attack it just because of it looked like a Mercury.
There you go.
And so but that's kidding, but it's also kind of half serious.
Yeah.
And so that's became a favorite fly. For trout, I like a fly called the Renegade on the Deschutes. And the Renegade was traditionally a dry fly meant to be probably fished in like a 14 or 12 or 10. But I started in the late 50s, I started tying a Renegade that was on a size 6 hook. It was almost the size of a golf ball. And I would cast it and just fish it right under the surface so I could see the fly, and I would pump it like it was like a spider, had all of this kind of webby action. And that to this day is still it's still one of my favorite flies for trout on the Deschutes.
There you go. All right, the Renegade. And what about for a resource? Do you have a good, if you had to pick one of your books or something out there that you have for steelhead, does anything come to mind?
Well, we've done so many steelhead books, and nothing offhand, comes to mind. But any book that we've ever done on steelhead, works.
You got plenty.
Yeah, there's so many. The techniques are so similar that if you get one good book, you're okay. You're on your way.
You're good to go. Yeah. Okay. And I was just thinking, I'm going to see really quick. See what pops up when I put in Frank Amato Steelhead books here. I'm just curious to see. Look, there's so many. I'm trying to think of one too that's not really coming off the top of my head. Well, it came up here, and this is something I was going to ask you about. But the Wild Steelheader Coalition. Maybe we can kind of wrap it up here. You noted some of the conservation stuff, but I think you were recently awarded. Let's see, was this recently? This might have been a little. a little ways
Well, it was
back.
probably about 10 years ago. The Wild Steelhead Coalition gave me a beautiful carved steelhead with my name on it and a plaque. And I love that fish, and I really appreciate it.
There you go. And that
they've done so much good work.
And that was for the work. Yeah. All some of the stuff you noted, and definitely. Your father, and all that he's done, and all of his friends. Oh my God, there's been a tremendous amount of, with Northwest Steelheaders and CCA and the Native Fish Society and the Federation and Trout Unlimited. It's a lot.
We have plenty of organizations, and if people want to contribute their time or a little bit of their money towards them, it's needed more now than ever.
Yeah. No, I hear you, Frank. No, I appreciate that. I think you're right. There's definitely still lots of struggles, but as long as we have some people fighting out there, we should hopefully be able to get there. Might take some time. That's the thing I joke about with my dad. I tell him, if it took us 100 or 200 years to get this point, it's not gonna be that quick to get back to the to more of the recovery stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it might not be in your lifetime, or maybe even not in my lifetime, but I mean, we can still keep focusing on it and teaching the kids, right?
Yeah, and with everything is really dependent upon climate. If we have a good climate and rich production in the ocean, we're going to be inundated with fish, and it's all up to the climate.
That's it. All right, well, Frank, one quick one here. So your go-to boat, if you had to pick between a jet sled, a drift boat, and your little one-man boat, if you could only pick one, what would it be?
At my age and the condition I'm in now, would be the little boat.
Okay.
The little rubber boat, the one-man boat. Yeah, good, because with it, I can wade safely. I don't have to worry about, falling in because I'm surrounded already by, buoyant material. I can sit while I do my fishing. I should write a book on how to sit and fish because I do all my fly fishing for winter steelhead sitting in that boat. Yeah, because you can, go down awesome. A river like the Kilchis or the Trask or, any of the coastal streams, the lower parts of the coastal streams, and you just put your feet down and you stop the boat and you start swinging the fly. It's just fantastic. And you don't need to be using one of these 13-foot rods, just a 12-foot switch rod. Works just great.
Oh, yeah, switch rod. Okay. And if you were on the Deschutes, that boat maybe would be. I occasionally see the float tubers. Yeah, that wouldn't be the same. Would that be okay to use out there in the lower river?
I've never used it. I've never used it on the Deschutes, but people, have fished out of the float tubes.
Yeah, the float tubes.
Using them for support in higher water. And so I think the same thing would be true of this other little boat, but particularly for the lower river where they use the float tubes, that's probably the best technique, the float tube, the way they use them now.
I know.
But for rivers in the wintertime that you're fishing in colder water, you can just, I always wear a balaclava and a hat with ear flaps and heavy undergarments, and I feel like it's just wonderful.
I know, I hear you. And then what was that that Volkswagen car in 1967? Was that a Bug or was that a Volkswagen van?
It was a Bug, and I used to pull a wood drift boat built by Boat Specialties in Salem. It was a 13-footer, a little boat. Yeah, I used to pull it behind the Volkswagen all the way to the Kalama and filled it to the Molalla, the Clackamas.
There you go.
Finally, in 76, I got an international Scout that could pull my drift boat, and I was able to then make it to the Deschutes with the drift boat.
Cool. I'll try to find a photo of that old drift boat. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, thank you, and tell your dad hi for sure.
I will, Frank. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for doing all the good work, and I'll let you know when this show comes out, and I'll give you a heads up, and I'll share it with you. And I think it's going to be good, so I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave.
All right, thanks. See ya. Okay, bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes, all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/113. Go to the resources page at wetflyswing.com/resources and find out what products are recommended by our guests on this podcast. If you purchase any of the products through those links, the podcast here will get a small commission, and it's a great way to support the show at no extra cost to you. We are getting closer to Alaska. If you want to check out what we have going and get some more information on heading up with me to one of the great places that we have, go to wetflyswing.com/AK. Thank you. I want to let you know I appreciate you. I appreciate the support. And if you are brand new to the podcast, you should send me an email at dave@wetflyswing.com or just mention at wetflyswing on any of the social media platforms out there, including maybe even Pinterest. I haven't dug into that yet. I guess if you are into Pinterest, maybe let me know on social. Thanks again for stopping by to check out the show today. I'm looking forward to catching up with you soon and hope to maybe see you online or maybe on that Alaskan river trip.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.